And right now, for a treat of treats, my friends, the birth of the talkies. We are going to see and hear on our program today films by Eddie Cantor and by Ben Burney that have been lost or suppressed for approximately 50 years. This is a TV first. You'll be seeing these films elsewhere, but once again, we've got them first. I think it's very necessary and very important. I think it's great to recognize achievement, and that's why today I want to pay tribute to one of the brilliant scientists of the 20th century, the late Dr. Lee DeForest. And I've got some kind of a feeling that if not for Dr. Lee DeForest, that I wouldn't be here at this microphone in this studio speaking over these airwaves. Nobody would be employed if not for Dr. Lee DeForest. Yes or no?
That's right, definitely.
Especially late movies.
Right?
Especially late movies.
Especially late movies, you're not kidding.
That's right.
Now, before I tell you about Maurice Zouary and his DeForest collection of films, you ever hear that expression, where's Papa?
Yes.
Would you say
right
that's
here.
Papa?
That's Papa.
Right
This man was the founder of WOR and the whole Mutual Network.
That's on February 22, 1922.
Jack Poppele.
49 years ago, Joe.
Alongside Mr. Poppele, who is also president of the DeForest Pioneers, is Mr. Maurice Zouary, who is the noted film historian and archivist and author. And Maurice, what is your, let's get the ball rolling now regarding Mr. DeForest, right?
As far as the early stars we were talking about before on radio, it seems that many of these great vaudevillians who made vaudeville popular at the turn of the century acted both and performed both in early radio to more or less break ground, as well as early sound motion pictures. Now, the early sound motion pictures, many believe that the Jazz Singer 1927 was the great year ushering in the era of sound, when it's not actually so. Sound motion pictures go back to a commercial distribution and production as early as 1921-22. In fact, Jack, if you recall, DeForest had a demonstration of the first sound prototypes to various bigwigs in the industry, and he submitted many of these prototypes to the major studios, who turned it down, feeling that sound was not what the people wanted. And he had a great struggle in his invention and making up the regular schedules of programs for commercial theatrical release. And that began in 1923. The Rivoli in New York, the Rialto, the Capitol Theater, all carried many of these great two-reelers, three-reelers, features, featurettes, operas, concerts, and many programs that is now in my collection, which is with the Library of Congress.
I want to say that we owe a large debt to Dr. DeForest for his wonderful accomplishments, for the fact that he made life more bearable and more wonderful, more enjoyable for so many millions of people. And
Joe, if I may insert here a moment, you know, a lot of the work that Dr. DeForest did or accomplished in those early days was done right within an area of probably about a quarter of a mile from this studio here on 42nd Street and 48th and Broadway.
Right in New York
His first studios were up on 48th Street. And there he did some of his early experimental work in sound motion pictures. That is, we had motion pictures, but there was no sound to it. And he developed a method whereby you could photograph sound on a film. And this led, of course, to the first showing of the motion pictures in the Rialto Theater that Maurice just mentioned a moment ago here on April the 12th, 1923.
And that was the beginning of sound pictures.
That's the beginning of commercial.
Well, let me go back even further than that. When DeForest invented the amplifier, which is the basis of all mass communication, this was 1906.
Yes.
And he envisioned at that time that movies could talk through a process of done photographically. And he could not attend to it at that time only because he saw the possibilities in radio broadcasting, and he had experiments at that point. But 1913, he and his staff and a very close associate, Dr. Elman Myers, experimented on the first sound motion picture. And they had as their star a dog, a mongrel dog, and this dog sat in front of the cameras. He barked, and he did a complete flip over. And this was the test. Now, they developed that test, and they played it back on DeForest sound equipment because there was no sound equipment at that time.
Right. And
sure enough, it was extremely successful. But then after that test, he had to continue with his radio work and the expansion in radio. But by 1918, 1919, he began to devote full time towards the more than just experimental work, but now in full commercialization of sound on film.
I noticed that in most of his sound on film work, Maurice, he got involved in photographing presidents and political figures.
Definitely,
If he had been very practical and very realistic, he would have concentrated more on entertainers, because the fellow who put out the Al Jolson movie, he reaped the benefit roundaboutly of Mr. DeForest's groundwork.
Well, let me explain that. You see, DeForest was always beset by finances. He couldn't get Wall Street to back him. He couldn't get the major studios to back him. And here he had the basic sound on film technology. He couldn't hire the great name writers, great name producers, great name directors, because the majors controlled them all.
Right.
He had to go on his own. And here was a genius, a scientist, an engineer, who turned producer. And he had a lot of showmanship in him in going into these phono films.
But, Jack, many times in life, Jack, I would say that a great genius or inventor or scientist does not live to reap the rewards of his genius, right?
Oh, I agree, Joe. In fact, I was reading the history last evening of Nikola Tesla, the man who was responsible for alternating current and the development of alternating current not only in America but throughout the world.
Right.
And this man at one time was worth $1 million, and when he died absolutely penniless and in the hands of a lot of people. Such the same with DeForest. DeForest, with all of his contributions and the fact that this book reveals that he has over 270 patents to his credit, he died absolutely penniless because he devoted all of his time, all of his energies, and all of his money into the development. In fact, it was a good thing also, Maurice, that he didn't spend all of his time on the development of motion pictures, because the first transmitter that WOR ever had was a DeForest transmitter.
Wow.
And if it hadn't been for DeForest transmitter, I don't know whether WOR and John Gamley would be with us today.
And what about me?
And you, or me.
He had Caruso. He had Caruso sing. He had members of the Metropolitan Opera House
But in the
on early radio.
In the finance department, in the businessman department, he did not profit.
He was a very poor businessman.
Did not profit too well personally.
No, not at all.
I'm going to show this book on the screen. This is one book that I want to read eventually. It's called Father of Radio, the autobiography of Dr.
Lee DeForest.
Was it his autobiography or no? He wrote this
He wrote it. Yeah.
And this will be a forthcoming record album.
That is a forthcoming record album of all of the original tracks from the original productions of phonofilms, which deal with all the great vaudevillians of that time, and Una Merkel and Elsa Lanchester and several others.
Well, even though some people know his name, I think it's very important that after today's show, many people will know of the name of Lee DeForest and his contributions to broadcasting and to the whole progress of the world, because he was the man whose basic techniques still make everything work.
He was also the father of radio, as this book here will reveal, and not only the father of radio, but he developed the vacuum tubes that made all these things possible. You know, today, Joe, we have an organization called the DeForest Pioneers, men who originally worked with Dr. DeForest and men who were associated with Dr. DeForest. And you know, this is one organization that isn't growing. It's sort of
tapering off.
It's tapering off because each year our membership roll becomes smaller. And although the men who have been president of the DeForest Pioneers in the past have held the office for only a year, I've had the office now for 3 years because we can't find anyone else.
Wow.
I think we're going to make Maurice president of the DeForest Pioneers, and we're going to make you an associate member, honorary member
I'd love
of
that.
the DeForest Pioneers.
I'd love that.
And we'll see that you get a certificate.
I would love to show for the first time on any TV screen Maurice Zouary's forthcoming book called The New History of Motion Picture Sound, First Sound of Movies by Maurice Zouary, an original true account. I'm going to find out now that the first talkie was not the jazz singer, even though the jazz singer got all the fanfare, got all the publicity. Mr. Zouary will set the scene. I'm sitting here with Mr. Maurice Zouary, who is the independent film producer in charge of the Lee DeForest Library. At the scene now for the old clips, please.
The three particular subjects.
Two. We're just going to show. I've got three, but I want to save the noble Cecil and Eubie Blake until we can get Cecil and Blake down here.
I see.
Sit
Very
with us
good.
and watch themselves.
Well, the first one is a few minutes of Ben Burney playing a medley of popular tunes, which was the Guy Lombardo of his day, or Lawrence Welk of his day. He was great vaudevillian, and he made these medleys in front of the DeForest sound film cameras in the studio. And the second one, of course, is Eddie Cantor, and that was made in 1922. By the way, Ben Burney was made in 1923, and the Eddie Cantor was made in 1922.
The birth of sound, right, Maurice? The beginning of sound.
Very first birth.
The beginning of sound on film technology, and these films being shown for the first time in about 50 years. Entertainers, my friends, of 50 years ago, and I want to make it very emphatic that that was a single system film or single system recording. It was not an accompanying phonograph record with wires going behind the screen. When DeForest did that, this
was recorded directly on the
sound
film,
on film.
With the picture simultaneously at one time with sound film cameras, and developed at the same time as well. He did attempt to make a separate system process also, whereas he would film the subjects first and the sound separately on two separate films, and then develop them both and make one particular positive print for release, which is a technological term.
Yeah, we get involved. But Mr. Zouary traces the beginning of sound on film back to 1913, back to the invention of the vacuum tube by Mr. DeForest, and this is something that I will not soon forget. Jack, you want to wrap it up for me?
Yes, you know, one of the interesting features about this particular film we were just watching here, this was recorded directly on film.
Right.
Later on, when The Jazz Singer was shown on Broadway, this was recorded on a disc, and the disc had to be synchronized with the film. And I don't know whether any of your listeners today, Joe, will remember that some of the early motion pictures, that the sound would always be ahead of the entertainer or in back of the entertainer. I recall one of the early sound pictures in which an entertainer had gone, he left the room, went through the door, and after 2 or 3 seconds, the door slammed. You heard the slam of the door. So it was dependent upon the control man up in the control room, the projectionist booth, who was smart enough to be able to synchronize that sound with the film. And many, many times we had the picture without sound and the sound without picture.
It was often out of sync, not just by a little bit, but sometimes by 12 minutes.
The needle would jump on the disc. And
right.
This is right.
Jack, you going to invite us to a dinner or something?
Well, I think we'd like to invite you, Joe, to the next DeForest Pioneers dinner in April, and I'll send you an invitation, a duly inscribed invitation. Not only would we like to invite you, but we'd like to ask you to speak to the group and tell about some of your experiences and what motion pictures has done for the industry, and also how you have, shall I say, profited by the use of pictures in your old-time movies.
Well, I think I can pretty modestly say, Jack, that my book called Classics of the Silent Screen, which came out in 1960, started the whole movie craze today, because today there are more movie books. If you go into any bookstore on Broadway, if you walk over to the cinema section, to the old movie section, you'll see more books than any other topic. And
is a very big thing.
My book was the first movie book, except for the Daniel Blum series, which, of course, is a legend. Right. Yeah. Mine was the forerunner of all of these movie books. Yes. Maurice, I wish we had hours. And you've given all of your films now to a non-profit organization.
No, this is directly with the Library of Congress, the National Film Collection. And they are in the business of preserving in their archives lost films or films that have a history for, I don't know, maybe centuries, who knows. But this belongs to the American people now. I did retain some commercial rights, mainly because I have a large investment in this, and we're out to make an album and a book and so forth and so on. But it does belong to the American people.
And to me whenever I want to borrow it, right?
And to you whenever you want to borrow it, definitely.
Okay.
And to the old-time movies.
Maurice and Jack, you've been beautiful. Mr. Maurice Zouary, great film historian, archivist, collector, author, and Jack Poppele, who founded WOR in 1922.